Imagine an invisible timer counting down. If just one 21-mile stretch of salt water is blocked, it takes exactly 24 hours for the global economy to spiral into total paralysis. 20% of the world's daily oil consumption. 30% of all liquefied natural gas. Trillions of dollars in international trade. All of it forced to squeeze through a geographic bottleneck narrower than the length of a single marathon. This is the Strait of Hormuz. And it is not merely a shipping lane on a map. It is a loaded gun pointed directly at the head of the modern world. And the finger resting on the trigger? Iran. If those waters are mined tomorrow, or if a localized naval skirmish spirals out of control, the shockwave doesn't stop in the sands of the Middle East. It crosses oceans and hits you directly. The price of a gallon of gas in your hometown doesn't just double, it shatters historical records. Global supply chains freeze overnight. The stock market hemorrhages. What starts as a regional dispute instantly morphs into a devastating global survival crisis. But to understand how we arrived at this terrifying standoff, you cannot just look at today's breaking news. You have to look into the ghosts of history. From the CIA-orchestrated shadows of Operation Ajax in 1953, a covert coup that sacrificed a nation's democracy on the altar of energy security, to the blazing, anti-Western fury of the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the brutal meat grinder of the Iran-Iraq War. Iran has not merely survived decades of sanctions and isolation. It has mutated. Outgunned and massively outspent by Western superpowers, Tehran realized a fundamental, chilling truth: you don't need a trillion-dollar military if you hold the keys to the world's engine. Instead, they built a shadow empire. An intricate axis of resistance, stretching from the Houthi rebels paralyzing the Red Sea to heavily armed proxies across the Levant. They rewrote the rulebook of asymmetric warfare, engineering a doctrine known as saturation deterrence. It is a military strategy so mathematically devastating that a direct, all-out conflict with Iran is a calculation the United States and its allies are deeply afraid to make. How did a proud, 2,500-year-old civilization transform historical humiliation into the ultimate geopolitical checkmate? What is the actual endgame behind their deeply guarded nuclear program? And most importantly, when the inevitable spark finally ignites the Persian Gulf, what is the exact, unstoppable chain of events that will bring the global economy to its knees? The trap has been set for over 70 years. And to understand how it snaps shut, we have to go back to the beginning. August 1953. The streets of Tehran are burning. But this isn't a spontaneous civilian uprising. It is a calculated, meticulously funded demolition. At this moment in history, Iran is a functioning, secular democracy. Its fiercely popular Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, has just made a fatal geopolitical miscalculation. He looked at the vast oceans of crude oil being pumped out from beneath Iranian soil, black gold that was aggressively enriching the British Empire while his own citizens lived in grinding poverty, and he committed the ultimate sin. He nationalized the oil. He took it back. London panicked. Washington listened. You have to understand exactly what crude oil meant in the early 1950s. It wasn't just fuel for cars. It was the absolute lifeblood of the new global order. The explosive post-war American boom, the sprawling suburbs, the new interstate highways, the unquestioned dominance of the US dollar, was fundamentally built on a fragile promise, an uninterrupted, hyper-cheap flow of Middle Eastern energy. Threatening that flow wasn't just bad for corporate profits. It was viewed as an existential threat to the American way of life itself. So, the CIA and MI6 pulled the trigger on Operation Ajax. Armed with briefcases of untraceable cash, bought-off military commanders, and orchestrated mob violence, they dismantled a sovereign democracy in a matter of days. Mossadegh was overthrown. The pliable, pro-Western monarch, the Shah, was cemented into absolute power. The oil pipelines opened back up. Western economies surged. For the intelligence agencies in Washington and London, it was hailed as a geopolitical masterstroke. A cheap, covert victory that secured the world's engine. But here is where the history books usually close the chapter, and where the invisible timer threatening your financial stability today actually starts ticking. Look closely at your world right now. The creeping inflation eating away at your savings. The paralyzing fear of supply chain collapses. The constant, looming anxiety over gas prices every time you pull up to a pump. You are told this is simply the cost of living in a complex modern economy. It isn't. You are living in the delayed blast wave of 1953. Here is the truth that foreign policy elites refuse to admit. We are taught that Operation Ajax was a necessary, successful mission to secure global energy. But the reality? The West didn't secure the oil. They built a geopolitical suicide vest and strapped it directly to the global economy. By crushing a moderate democracy to protect corporate interests, they installed a ruthless dictator. For 25 years, the Shah's brutal secret police crushed all secular political dissent, leaving the Iranian people with only one safe place to organize: the radical, anti-Western mosques. The United States didn't eliminate the threat to the Strait of Hormuz. They engineered the very monster that is holding it hostage today. Fast forward to 1979. The pressure cooker explodes. The Shah is violently ousted. The Ayatollah returns from exile. A radical theocracy seizes control. The U.S. Embassy is overrun, and 52 Americans are taken hostage. In Washington, it was viewed as a shocking, unprovoked crisis. In Tehran, it was exactly 26 years of deferred vengeance. But 1979 didn't just create a new enemy. It created an isolated one. Within months, Saddam Hussein saw a golden opportunity. Backed by Western intelligence and billions in foreign aid, Iraq invaded Iran. The world assumed the newly fractured Islamic Republic would collapse in weeks. It didn't. The Iran-Iraq War dragged on for 8 agonizing years. Over 1 million lives were fed into a senseless meat grinder of trench warfare and chemical weapons. While the world watched the bloodshed, Iran's leadership learned a chilling lesson. The international community would never come to their rescue. Conventional warfare was a superpowers game, and Iran was outgunned, outspent, and entirely alone. If they were going to survive in a hostile world, they had to rewrite the rules of war. So, they went into the shadows. If you can't buy F-35 fighter jets to match the U.S. Air Force, you don't try. Instead, you fund Hezbollah in Lebanon. You arm militias in Iraq. You train the Houthis in Yemen. You build an invisible, heavily armed web across the Middle East. The axis of resistance wasn't born out of blind religious zealotry. It was a masterpiece of cold, hard military survival. And this is where the crosshairs lock onto the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's generals looked at the map. They looked at the massive American aircraft carriers patrolling their waters. And they realized they didn't need to defeat the U.S. military to win. They just needed to make the cost of a war completely unpayable. Enter the doctrine of saturation deterrence. They didn't build battleships. They built thousands of cheap, untraceable sea mines. Swarms of hyperagile fast attack boats. Thousands of anti-ship missiles bolted to the back of commercial trucks, hidden deep within the jagged, mountainous coastline of the Persian Gulf. They mass-produced suicide drones that cost less than a used car, designed specifically to overwhelm billion-dollar Western defense grids. If Washington or Tel Aviv strikes Tehran, Tehran doesn't strike back at Washington. They strike the water. They choke the 21-mile vein. They trigger a global margin call. This isn't a hypothetical Pentagon wargame. The infrastructure for this exact economic doomsday scenario is already active, hiding in plain sight. And right now, as centrifuge rotors spin faster inside heavily fortified underground mountains, the ultimate trigger for this trap is being quietly assembled. The uranium centrifuges buried deep beneath the Fordow Mountain facility are not merely spinning to build a single weapon. They are spinning to forge an impenetrable, invisible shield. This is the true endgame of Iran's deeply guarded nuclear program. Tehran knows a nuclear warhead is rarely meant to be fired. It is meant to be held. Once they cross that irreversible threshold, the geopolitical chessboard flips entirely. Their sprawling axis of resistance will no longer operate in the shadows, it will operate under a nuclear umbrella. Absolute, untouchable immunity. Any preemptive strike against their proxy militias, or their missile silos, or their coastlines, will carry the catastrophic risk of a nuclear retaliation. This is how a proud, 2,500-year-old civilization transforms decades of historical humiliation into the ultimate geopolitical checkmate. They realized they didn't need to defeat the American military. They simply had to weaponize the modern world's fatal flaw, its absolute addiction to a frictionless flow of energy. By positioning their cheapest, most disposable asymmetric weapons directly at the jugular of international trade, they turned the West's greatest strength, its massive, interconnected global economy, into a suicide vest. And when the inevitable spark finally ignites the Persian Gulf, the unstoppable chain of events will not look like a traditional war. It will look like sudden, suffocating paralysis. The moment a localized skirmish escalates and a single commercial tanker is struck in that 21-mile bottleneck, maritime insurance premiums will not just spike. They will cease to exist. No underwriter on Earth will insure a multi-million-dollar vessel sailing into a saturation deterrence kill zone. Overnight, the world's largest shipping conglomerates will drop anchor and refuse to move. 20% of the global oil supply and 30% of all liquefied natural gas instantly evaporates from the market. Within 48 hours, energy grids across Europe and Asia face rolling blackouts. Heavy manufacturing grinds to a catastrophic halt. Within a week, the cost of global logistics, raw materials, and food distribution surges to numbers that break modern forecasting models. Sovereign debt spirals. The stock market violently recalibrates to a dark new reality. You will not need to turn on the breaking news to know the Strait of Hormuz has been closed. You will feel the blast wave the very next morning when you pull up to a gas pump, when you step into a grocery store, or when you watch your life savings hemorrhage in real time. For 70 years, the foreign policy elite have sold us a comfortable illusion. They told us that the shadowy coups and military interventions of the past secured the global engine. But history is remarkably patient. The West spent trillions of dollars building the most complex, wealth-generating economic machine the world has ever seen. And Iran spent 70 years meticulously placing their finger on the single, irreplaceable power switch. The invisible timer we started with does not tick in seconds or minutes. It ticks in geopolitical miscalculations. For decades, the architects of the modern global order believed they had engineered an unbreakable system. They mapped out international shipping lanes, standardized global logistics, and tied the sheer survival of modern economies directly to the uninterrupted flow of Middle Eastern energy. They built a towering, hyper-efficient house of cards, completely dependent on the dangerous assumption that military supremacy could always guarantee economic security. That was the fatal flaw. Tehran realized what Washington and London refused to see. You cannot bomb an economic chain reaction. You cannot deploy an aircraft carrier to lower maritime insurance premiums. And a trillion-dollar stealth fighter is absolutely powerless against a global market panic. This is the ultimate realization of their 2,500-year evolution. Iran did not just survive the crushing weight of Western sanctions and decades of isolation. They weaponized the very system designed to break them. By placing their cheapest, most asymmetric assets squarely at the jugular of international trade, they completely inverted the global power dynamic. They took the massive, interconnected beast of the modern economy and turned it into the ultimate hostage. The geopolitical checkmate is now complete. The nuclear umbrella they are forging in the dark beneath the mountains will not be the weapon that ultimately strikes the West. The weapon is the water itself. The weapon is your absolute dependency. When you trace the line all the way back to the burning streets of Tehran in 1953, the bitter irony of history becomes impossible to ignore. Operation Ajax was supposed to be the definitive masterstroke that permanently secured the world's energy supply. By dismantling a sovereign democracy to keep the cheap oil flowing, Western intelligence agencies firmly believed they were protecting the American way of life. Instead, they handed the ignition switch of the global economy to the exact people they spent a century humiliating. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a geographic bottleneck on a map. It is a mirror, reflecting the terrifying fragility of the illusion we call modern civilization. Everything you own, everything you buy, and the very stability of your financial future rely entirely on a 21-mile stretch of salt water that the West does not control. The trap has been flawlessly set. The mechanism is locked. The Shadow Empire is waiting. And the finger remains resting quietly on the trigger. The invisible timer we warned you about is no longer just ticking. It is approaching zero. For decades, you have been living inside a carefully curated mirage. A reality where you can swipe a credit card, order a product manufactured an ocean away, and effortlessly fill your gas tank without ever having to think about the violent, blood-soaked history required to make it all happen. You were told the global economy was a resilient, unshakable fortress. You were told the geopolitical masters in Washington and London had permanently secured the system. But the fortress has a kill switch. We asked how a proud, 2,500-year-old civilization transformed a century of humiliation into the ultimate geopolitical checkmate. The answer is terrifyingly simple. Iran did not fight the global machine. They wired themselves directly into its most vulnerable circuitry. The ghosts of 1953 have finally come to collect their debt. When Western intelligence agencies handed out briefcases of cash to crush Iranian democracy in the name of cheap oil, they believed they were buying eternal energy security. They were wrong. They bought the very rope that now hangs directly over the most critical bottleneck in international trade. Look at the chessboard today. The uranium centrifuges spinning deep beneath fortified mountains are not meant to incinerate a Western city. They are the ultimate, untouchable shield. They lock the United States into a paralyzed standoff, granting the axis of resistance absolute immunity, as it slowly tightens the noose. The swarms of hyperagile boats, the hidden anti-ship missiles, the thousands of untraceable sea mines waiting in the dark, these are not weapons of traditional warfare. They are instruments of global economic mass destruction. When that single, 21-mile stretch of salt water goes dark, the shockwave cannot be intercepted by an air defense system. It detonates directly in your hometown. The catastrophic supply chain freezes, the hyperinflation destroying your savings, the paralyzing cost of basic survival. It all traces back to this exact geographical jugular. We are standing at the absolute precipice of a dark new era. The grand illusion of Western military supremacy guaranteeing a frictionless world has shattered. An isolated nation, outspent by trillions and suffocated by decades of sanctions, realized the chilling truth: to bring the modern world to its knees, you don't need a massive army. You just need to weaponize our own unyielding dependency. You just need to hold the single key to the world's engine. The Strait of Hormuz is the loaded gun. The safety is off. The entire modern economy is strapped tightly to the barrel. And the architects of the Shadow Empire are simply watching the clock, waiting for the world to make one fatal move. The ultimate answer to the 2,500-year-old question is not found in military strategy, but in psychological mastery. Iran understood a fundamental law of power that Western empires forgot. You do not need to slay the giant if you can simply stop its heart. They looked at the sprawling, trillion-dollar architecture of globalized capitalism and identified its single exposed nerve. 21 miles of salt water. This is the definitive geopolitical checkmate. The West spent the better part of a century engineering a hyper-connected, frictionless world fueled by an endless stream of Middle Eastern oil. They overthrew democracies, installed dictators, and parked nuclear-powered aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf to guarantee that system would never falter. But in doing so, they engineered their own ultimate vulnerability. Iran did not build a military to defeat the United States. They built a mechanism to paralyze it. The spinning uranium centrifuges beneath the Zagros Mountains, the sprawling network of proxy militias across the Levant, the thousands of untraceable sea mines waiting in the dark, none of these exist to win a conventional war. They exist to make the cost of firing the first shot completely unthinkable. The nuclear program is the impenetrable vault door. The axis of resistance is the alarm system. And the Strait of Hormuz is the hostage locked inside. When you pull up to the gas pump tomorrow morning, when you look at the creeping cost of groceries, or when you watch global markets violently shudder at a single breaking news alert from the Middle East, you are not just experiencing the friction of modern economics. You are feeling the gravitational pull of a trap set in 1953. You are living inside a fragile illusion of stability, subsidized by a geographic choke point that could go dark in a matter of hours. The grand illusion of untouchable Western military supremacy has evaporated. Aircraft carriers and stealth bombers are entirely useless against a hyperinflated, suffocating global margin call. Iran knows that the moment the waters of Hormuz are mined, the global supply chain does not just slow down. It shatters. The shelves empty. The grids fail. The modern world starves for the very energy it needs to survive. The invisible timer we warned you about has finished counting down. It is no longer ticking. It is simply waiting. The board is set. The Shadow Empire holds the single key to the world's engine. And the most terrifying truth of the modern era is that the architects of the global economy have absolutely no way to take it back. The invisible timer we started with has finally stopped ticking. It is no longer a countdown. It is a state of suspended animation. For over 7 decades, the architects of the global order operated under a fatal delusion. They believed that by drawing lines on maps, toppling sovereign governments, and parking nuclear-powered aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, they could bend the geography of the Middle East to their absolute will. They believed they owned the engine. They forgot who controls the ignition. This is the definitive answer to how a 2,500-year-old civilization engineered the perfect geopolitical checkmate. Iran never needed to defeat the American empire on a traditional battlefield. They simply let the empire outgrow its own armor. They watched as the West built a towering, hyper-connected global economy utterly addicted to a frictionless flow of cheap energy. And then, they quietly positioned themselves at the base of that towering house of cards, holding a single, 21-mile-wide match. You wanted to know the exact, unstoppable chain of events that brings this system to its knees. It does not begin with a mushroom cloud. It begins with total paralysis. It is the sudden, terrifying gridlock of massive container ships dropping anchor in the Gulf of Oman. It is the instant evaporation of maritime insurance. It is the severing of the ocean's main artery by swarms of disposable drones and thousands of untraceable sea mines. Within mere hours, that localized friction morphs into a devastating blast wave hitting your hometown. It is the unprecedented surge in the cost of everything you consume. The rolling blackouts shutting down heavy manufacturing. The violent, permanent recalibration of your financial security. The ghosts of Operation Ajax did not just haunt the burning streets of Tehran. They crossed the ocean and embedded themselves into the very foundation of your daily life. When Western intelligence agencies crushed a moderate democracy in 1953 to guarantee the flow of crude oil, they did not buy permanent energy security. They bought a 70-year delay. They built a spectacular, wealth-generating global machine, and they handed the kill switch to a nation that has spent generations mastering the cold, hard mathematics of survival. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a geographic bottleneck. It is the ultimate mirror, reflecting the terrifying fragility of modern human civilization. The trap is entirely flawless. The geography is unforgiving. And the loaded gun pointed directly at the head of the global economy remains firmly in the hands of the very people the West spent a century trying to erase. The invisible timer we warned you about at the very beginning has finally stopped ticking. It is no longer a countdown. It is a permanent state of suspended animation. For over 7 decades, the architects of the global order operated under a fatal delusion. They believed that by drawing lines on maps, toppling sovereign governments, and parking nuclear-powered aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, they could bend the geography of the Middle East to their absolute will. They believed they owned the engine. They forgot who controls the ignition. This is the definitive answer to how a 2.5-millennia-old civilization engineered the perfect geopolitical checkmate. Iran never needed to defeat the American empire on a traditional battlefield. They simply let the empire outgrow its own armor. They watched as the West built a towering, hyper-connected economy utterly addicted to a frictionless flow of cheap energy. And then, they quietly positioned themselves at the base of that towering house of cards, holding a single, 21-mile-wide match. You wanted to know the exact, unstoppable chain of events that brings this system to its knees. It does not begin with a mushroom cloud. It begins with total paralysis. It is the sudden, terrifying gridlock of massive container ships dropping anchor in the Gulf of Oman. It is the instant evaporation of maritime insurance. It is the severing of the ocean's main artery by swarms of disposable drones and thousands of untraceable sea mines. Within exactly 24 hours, that localized friction morphs into a devastating blast wave hitting your hometown. It is the unprecedented surge in the cost of everything you consume. The rolling blackouts shutting down heavy manufacturing. The violent, permanent recalibration of your financial security. The ghosts of Operation Ajax did not just haunt the burning streets of Tehran. They crossed the ocean and embedded themselves into the very foundation of your daily life. When Western intelligence agencies crushed a moderate democracy in 1953 to guarantee the flow of crude oil, they did not buy permanent energy security. They bought a 70-year delay. They built a spectacular, wealth-generating global machine, and they handed the kill switch to a nation that has spent generations mastering the cold, hard mathematics of survival. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a geographic bottleneck. It is the ultimate mirror, reflecting the terrifying fragility of modern human civilization. The trap is entirely flawless. The geography is unforgiving. And the loaded gun pointed directly at the head of the global economy remains firmly in the hands of the very people the West spent a century trying to erase. 70 years of Western illusion could be wiped away in a single afternoon. $43 trillion. That's the value of global prosperity being weighed on a narrow strip of water less than 21 miles wide. We've peeled back the layers of history, from the ghost of Operation Ajax in 1953 to swarms of cheap drones challenging billion-dollar supercarriers. What you've just seen isn't an action movie scenario, but the brutal reality of the fragility of the modern world. A world whose stability rests not in the hands of politicians in Washington or Brussels, but on a finger on a trigger in Tehran. The system you believe in, from the electricity in your home, the food on your supermarket shelves, to the value of your savings in the bank, is, in fact, a castle built on sand. And the tide in Hormuz is rising. If severing a geographical lifeline can bring an entire civilization to a standstill in just 24 hours, then you need to ask, how many similar, dead zones, are lurking within the global power structure? The answer lies in another, even more brutal and direct reality. If Hormuz is the switch that kills the flow of energy, then the monetary system we use is the soul of that machine, a soul also under serious threat. Right now, another geopolitical shift is taking place in the corridors of power from Beijing to Moscow, directly challenging the dominance of the US dollar. Don't be surprised by the devastating shifts of history when they knock on your door. To understand the next piece in this global checkmate game, how empires are quietly undermining the Western economy through a currency war, click on the video currently playing out. It's not just knowledge, it's a toolkit to help you identify and survive in an era where the old rules have been torn apart. The clock has stopped. The real game has only just begun. Subscribe and choose to watch the next video now to join us in deciphering the underlying realities that are reshaping your future. Don't stand on the sidelines as the final cards are about to be revealed.